Chapter 1. You start noticing it without reacting to it, not judging it, not even feeling anything about it, just noticing the repetition, the same filters, the same poses, the same captions that sound like they were written by the same invisible hand, the same jokes recycled with slightly different fonts, the same outrage on the same days, the same sympathy for the same narratives, the same enemies, the same heroes. It's not one woman, it's dozens, hundreds, and eventually the pattern becomes so consistent that it stops feeling personal at all. It feels industrial. You scroll past a story and you already know the next slide before it loads. You know the tone, you know the posture, you know the punchline, you know the belief hiding underneath it, not because you're psychic, but because you've seen this exact configuration too many times for it to be coincidence. The timing is familiar. The emotional beat is familiar. The moral conclusion is familiar. And what's interesting is how little variation there actually is once you strip away the aesthetics. This isn't about uniqueness or beauty or even intelligence. It's about inputs. What someone consumes all day eventually shows up in how they speak, how they react, how they interpret the world. You already know this. You see it in politics. You see it in culture. You see it in men who spend all day watching certain content and then wonder why they sound the same. Women are not exempt from this. No one is. Algorithms don't care about individuality. They care about engagement. And engagement is driven by emotion, not truth. So you start paying attention to what shows up on her story. Not in a paranoid way, in a curious way. You notice what she laughs at, what she reposts, what she validates, what she condemns. You notice which pages appear over and over. You notice whether her content is observational or reactive, whether it's reflective or performative, whether it's grounded in lived experience or borrowed outrage. And slowly, a picture forms, not of her personality, but of her programming. The mistake men make is thinking this stuff is harmless, that it's just jokes, just memes, just entertainment. But beliefs don't enter the mind through lectures. They enter through repetition, through humor, through emotional alignment, through seeing the same idea framed 1,000 slightly different ways until it feels like common sense. And once something feels like common sense, it stops being questioned. It becomes identity. It becomes how someone sees the world, even if they'd never explain it that way out loud. You can tell when someone's inner world is being shaped externally because their reactions are predictable. Not thoughtful. Predictable. You already know how she's going to interpret a situation before she opens her mouth. You already know who she's going to side with. You already know what the moral takeaway will be. And that predictability isn't comforting, it's constraining. Because relationships aren't built on agreement alone. They're built on how someone thinks when things don't fit the script they've been handed. At first, you might think you're overanalyzing, that you're reading too much into social media. But then you see it play out in real time. The same phrases come out of her mouth that you saw in her story the night before. The same arguments, the same emotional framing, the same sense of certainty without depth. And you realize you're not dealing with a person who arrived at these conclusions through experience or reflection. You're dealing with someone who absorbed them passively and now defends them as if they were self-evident truths. This matters because relationships don't just happen during good times. They happen when stress hits, when conflict appears, when life doesn't follow the expected narrative, and people who are heavily programmed react poorly to disruption. They don't pause and think. They default to scripts. They reach for slogans. They moralize instead of reasoning. They escalate instead of understanding. And chaos doesn't come from malice. It comes from rigidity. You've probably seen this before without connecting the dots. A small disagreement turns into a referendum on character. A simple boundary becomes an attack. A difference of opinion becomes proof of wrongdoing. And suddenly, you're not talking to a person. You're arguing with a worldview that wasn't built through dialogue and can't be challenged by it. That's exhausting. Not because disagreement is bad, but because there's no flexibility, no curiosity, no space for nuance. Here's the part that's easy to miss. This isn't about thinking the same way you do. It's about whether someone can think independently at all. You can disagree with a thoughtful person and still feel respected. You can disagree with a programmed person and feel like you're stepping on a landmine. One invites conversation, the other invites chaos. And chaos isn't loud at first. It's subtle. It shows up as misinterpretation, as unnecessary tension, as emotional volatility that seems to come out of nowhere. You might tell yourself you can manage it, that you're strong enough, calm enough, rational enough to balance it out. But relationships don't average out like math problems. The more rigid partner sets the emotional tone. The more reactive partner dictates the atmosphere. And over time, you either adapt to that chaos or you live in constant friction trying to avoid it. Neither option ends well. There's a story that illustrates this better than theory ever could. A man I knew started dating a woman who seemed fine at first glance, attractive, social, easy to be around. But her social media was a steady stream of outrage, sarcasm, and performative moral takes. He ignored it, said it didn't matter, said it was just jokes. 6 months later, every disagreement followed the same pattern. She assumed intent. She escalated quickly. She framed herself as morally correct before the conversation even began. He wasn't arguing with her. He was arguing with whatever she had absorbed that week. The relationship didn't end in one big explosion. It eroded under constant, unnecessary tension. And when it finally ended, he said something simple. I felt like I was living inside someone else's algorithm. That sentence sticks because it captures the problem perfectly. You're not choosing a partner in a vacuum. You're choosing their inputs, their influences, their emotional diet. And if that diet is built on outrage, comparison, and constant validation, you don't get to opt out of the effects just because you don't consume the same content. You're in it. You're living with the downstream consequences of what someone else feeds their mind every day. This isn't about demonizing anyone. It's about pattern recognition. The same way you'd avoid building a business with someone who gets all their ideas from headlines and never reads past the title. The same way you'd be cautious about trusting someone whose opinions change every time the trend shifts. You're not wrong for noticing this. You're not shallow for paying attention. You're observant. And observation is a survival skill, not a character flaw. If you've ever ignored this stuff and paid for it later, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You felt the chaos before you could explain it. You felt the instability, the emotional whiplash, the sense that you were always reacting instead of building. If that resonates, hit like on this video, because you've lived the consequence of not paying attention to the signs that were visible the entire time. The uncomfortable truth is that uniqueness isn't claimed, it's demonstrated. And people who are genuinely individual don't look identical in their thoughts, reactions, and beliefs. They diverge, they surprise you, they think for themselves. When someone's inner world looks mass-produced, their behavior will be too. And mass-produced behavior doesn't create stable, grounded relationships. It creates cycles, drama, predictability masked as passion. This chapter isn't telling you to hate anyone. It's telling you to stop being naive, to understand that what someone consumes becomes who they are, to recognize that algorithms don't just sell products, they sell worldviews. And when you invite someone into your life, you're inviting their worldview with them. If you don't pay attention to that early, you'll be forced to deal with it later when the stakes are higher and leaving is harder. Pay attention quietly. Observe without announcing it. Notice patterns without arguing about them. And trust the part of you that feels tension before you can articulate why. That part isn't insecure. It's perceptive. And perception, when you stop ignoring it, saves you from chaos you never needed to experience in the first place. Chapter 2. You notice it more clearly once you stop trying to explain it away. The first time you tell yourself you're being judgmental. The second time you shrug it off as coincidence. By the third or fourth time, it stops feeling accidental and starts feeling mechanical. The same emotional beats arrive on the same days, the same outrage spikes, the same "can you believe this" tone shows up right on schedule. And what's unsettling isn't the opinion itself, it's how interchangeable it feels. As if you could swap the face out and the message would still land exactly the same. You don't even need to dig deep to see it. You don't need to snoop or analyze. It's right there in plain sight. The memes that repeat the same worldview. The reposts that frame everything as victim versus villain. The constant validation of emotional reactions over thoughtful responses. And what stands out isn't passion. It's certainty. The kind of certainty that doesn't come from reflection, but from repetition. The kind that feels borrowed instead of earned. At first, it doesn't seem like it should matter. You tell yourself it's just social media, just entertainment, just a way to pass time. But then you start noticing how the tone bleeds into real life. A small inconvenience gets treated like a personal attack. A disagreement becomes a moral failure. A neutral comment gets interpreted as hostility. And you realize this isn't about Instagram at all. It's about how someone's mind has been trained to process the world. Fast, emotional, binary, always on edge. People like to pretend they're immune to influence, that they scroll and consume without absorbing. But that's not how the human mind works. Whatever you feed it repeatedly becomes familiar. Whatever becomes familiar starts to feel normal. And whatever feels normal becomes the default response under stress. So when you're dealing with someone whose default responses have been shaped by outrage-driven content, you don't get calm problem-solving when things go wrong. You get scripts. You get reactions that feel preloaded, like they were waiting for an excuse to fire. This is where men get caught off guard. In the beginning, things are smooth. She's fun. She's engaging. She's expressive. You don't challenge anything because there's nothing to challenge yet. But once real life enters the picture, once there's disagreement, boundaries, pressure, or responsibility, you see the pattern activate. Conversations stop being about understanding and start being about positioning, about who's right, who's wrong, who's justified. And suddenly you're not dealing with a person who's curious about resolution. You're dealing with a belief system that's already decided who the villain is supposed to be. You can feel the difference in your body when this happens. Your shoulders tighten. Your words get careful. You start choosing silence over honesty because honesty feels like it will trigger something disproportionate. That's not peace. That's avoidance. And avoidance isn't a sign of maturity. It's a sign you're walking on eggshells around someone whose emotional framework can't tolerate nuance. That framework didn't come from nowhere. It was installed gradually, one post at a time, one viral opinion at a time, one algorithmic reinforcement loop at a time. The scary part isn't that these ideas exist. It's that they're rarely questioned. When someone's worldview is being reinforced constantly by the same sources, dissent doesn't feel like disagreement. It feels like threat. And once disagreement feels like threat, conversation becomes impossible. You're no longer exchanging ideas. You're navigating landmines. And relationships built on landmines don't last. They just exhaust the person trying to avoid them. You might think you can be the calm one, the rational one, the stabilizing force. But that dynamic never stays balanced. The more reactive partner sets the emotional weather. The more rigid thinker defines the boundaries of what can be discussed. Over time, you either adapt by shrinking your honesty or you live in constant conflict. Neither outcome builds anything worth keeping. You don't win by being the only adult in the room forever. You just get tired. There's a subtle arrogance in heavy programming that most people don't recognize in themselves. It's the belief that your emotional reaction is the correct one, simply because it's shared by many. When thousands of people repost the same take, it feels validated, it feels true, it feels obvious, and to anyone who questions it, feels ignorant or malicious. That's not confidence, that's crowdsourced thinking. And crowdsourced thinking collapses the moment reality doesn't fit the script cleanly. You see this when something personal happens, something that doesn't align neatly with the memes, a complex situation, a gray area, a conflict that requires patience and accountability from both sides. Instead of slowing down, she speeds up. Instead of listening, she reaches for language she's already rehearsed online. She frames herself as right and you as wrong before the conversation has even started. And suddenly, you're not trying to resolve an issue. You're defending yourself against a narrative that was written long before you entered the scene. This is where chaos actually comes from. Not from arguments, not from passion, from predictability, from knowing that any disagreement will follow the same arc. Escalation, moral framing, emotional certainty, withdrawal, or explosion. And once you've seen that arc enough times, you stop engaging honestly. You start managing instead. And managing another adult's emotional responses is not a partnership. It's unpaid labor. There was a moment with a woman I once observed closely that made this impossible to ignore. A minor scheduling issue turned into a full-blown character judgment, not because the issue was serious, but because her online world had taught her that inconvenience equals disrespect and disagreement equals danger. The conversation wasn't about the actual problem. It was about defending an identity that had been shaped by what she consumed every day. No flexibility, no curiosity, just reaction. Watching that from the outside made it painfully clear how little room there was for real intimacy in that kind of dynamic. Intimacy requires the ability to think independently, to pause, to consider, to say, maybe I'm wrong. Programming removes that pause. It replaces thought with reflex, and reflexes are useful in emergencies, not relationships. A relationship built on reflexive thinking is always one misunderstanding away from collapse. You might survive it for a while. You might even mistake the intensity for connection. But eventually, the lack of depth shows. And when it does, it's usually too late to fix. This is why paying attention early matters, not obsessively, not judgmentally, just honestly. What someone posts isn't random. It's a window into what they find meaningful, what they find funny, what they find offensive, and what they find validating. It shows you how they process the world when no one is watching. And when you ignore that information, you're not being open-minded. You're being careless with your own future. If you've ever found yourself thinking, why does this feel harder than it should? This is probably why. Not because she's evil, not because she's broken, because her thinking has been shaped by systems designed to amplify emotion, conflict, and certainty. And those systems don't produce stable partners. They produce predictable reactions, predictable chaos, and chaos, even when it's subtle, drains the life out of anything you're trying to build. If this chapter feels uncomfortably familiar, share it with someone who keeps saying social media doesn't matter. It does. Not because it's powerful on its own, but because it's repetitive, and repetition shapes behavior. If you want to understand people better instead of being blindsided by patterns you ignored, stay with this conversation. The next chapter goes deeper into why this programming creates conflict even when intentions are good, and how ignoring it early is how men end up living inside drama they never asked for. Chapter 3. You don't see the damage immediately because it doesn't announce itself as damage. It shows up as friction you can't quite explain. A feeling that conversations take more effort than they should. That clarity keeps slipping out of reach even when you're saying reasonable things. You start replaying exchanges in your head, not because you're obsessed, but because something didn't line up. You said one thing, she heard another. You explained calmly. It escalated anyway. And after a while, you stop asking why and start adjusting how you speak, what you say, what you avoid. That adjustment feels mature at first, like you're being considerate, like you're choosing peace. But peace built on self-censorship doesn't last. The tension comes from a mismatch that most men don't name early enough. You're operating from lived experience, pattern recognition, and a desire for resolution. She's operating from narratives that have already assigned roles before the situation unfolds. Those narratives weren't built with you in mind. They were built for engagement. They reward outrage, certainty, and emotional payoff. So when something real happens, something unscripted, there's no flexibility. The response arrives prepackaged, and suddenly, you're not dealing with the moment. You're dealing with a story that's been rehearsed 100 times online. This is why small issues don't stay small. A missed call isn't just a missed call. It's neglect. A disagreement isn't just a difference of perspective. It's a character flaw. A boundary isn't a boundary. It's rejection. You notice how quickly things jump levels, how fast meaning gets attached, and you start feeling like you're always on trial for things you never intended. That's not because you're careless. It's because the interpretive lens being used isn't neutral. It's already colored by a worldview that expects conflict and validates reaction over reflection. At first, you try to reason through it. You slow down. You explain context. You choose your words carefully. And sometimes it works, temporarily. But the relief never lasts. Because you're not addressing the root. You're negotiating with symptoms. The root is that her thinking has been shaped in an environment where speed matters more than accuracy, and emotion matters more than nuance. And once that shaping is deep enough, calm reasoning feels threatening. It feels like dismissal. It feels like invalidation. So even your attempts at resolution get reframed as problems. This is where men start doubting themselves, not in an obvious way, subtly. You wonder if you really were insensitive, if you really did miss something obvious, if your standards are unreasonable. And because you care about fairness, you're willing to examine yourself. That's healthy. But when you're the only one doing that examination, something's wrong. A relationship can't be balanced if one person is constantly adjusting and the other is constantly reacting. Over time, that imbalance erodes your confidence, not because you're weak, but because you're living in a distorted mirror. You can feel the shift when you stop speaking freely, when you start pre-editing your thoughts, when you choose silence, not because you have nothing to say, but because you don't want the fallout. That's when you know you're not in a partnership anymore. You're in a containment strategy. You're managing reactions instead of building understanding. And no man thrives in that environment. He survives it, barely. There's a difference between emotional expression and emotional dominance. Expression allows space. Dominance takes it. When someone's inner world is heavily shaped by algorithmic reinforcement, expression often turns into dominance without them realizing it. Their feelings become facts, their reactions become moral truths, and anyone who questions them becomes suspect. That dynamic doesn't require yelling or insults. It operates quietly, through framing, through certainty, through the assumption that disagreement equals harm. You might notice how often accountability flows in one direction. You're expected to understand, to adapt, to apologize, to explain. And when you ask for the same in return, the conversation derails. Suddenly you're accused of being cold, or dismissive, or argumentative. The request itself becomes the problem. That's not a communication issue. That's a power issue. And power shaped by algorithms doesn't negotiate, it performs. Here's a story that clarifies this without exaggeration. A man I spoke to was in a relationship that looked fine from the outside. No screaming, no cheating, no chaos you could point to. But every disagreement followed the same invisible script. He would raise a concern calmly. She would respond emotionally. He would try to clarify. She would escalate the framing. By the end, he was apologizing for bringing it up at all, not because he was wrong, but because continuing felt pointless. When he finally ended it, he said something simple. I felt like I was arguing with the internet through one person. That wasn't bitterness. It was recognition. What made it worse was that she genuinely believed she was being reasonable. That's the danger of heavy programming. It doesn't feel imposed. It feels obvious. It feels like common sense. And common sense is rarely questioned. When someone believes their worldview is simply reality, there's no room for dialogue. Dialogue requires the possibility of being wrong. Algorithms don't encourage that possibility. They reward certainty. They reward alignment. They punish doubt. This is why men who ignore these signs early end up confused later. They think the chaos came out of nowhere, that she changed, that something flipped. But nothing flipped. The programming was always there. It just hadn't been activated by real pressure yet. When life was light, it stayed hidden. When stakes increased, it took over. And by then, you were already invested, already attached, already negotiating against yourself to make it work. Pay attention to how she talks about people she disagrees with, not whether she disagrees, but how. Is there curiosity? Is there restraint? Or is there moral certainty and dismissal? Pay attention to whether she can sit with ambiguity or needs immediate conclusions, whether she can say, I don't know, or always needs to be right. Those traits don't come from nowhere. They're reinforced daily by what she consumes, and they don't disappear in relationships. They intensify. You might think love can soften this, that your presence can ground her. Sometimes it can, briefly. But you can't out-regulate a system that's constantly reinforcing the opposite. You become the counterweight to an entire feed. And that's exhausting. Not heroic. Exhausting. Over time, you either give up trying or you become reactive yourself. Neither outcome is growth. This isn't about avoiding strong opinions, it's about avoiding rigidity. A woman who thinks deeply will surprise you. She won't always align with trends. She won't always react predictably. She'll pause, she'll ask questions, she'll change her mind when new information arrives. That flexibility is the foundation of intimacy. Without it, everything becomes a performance. Every conflict becomes a stage. Every disagreement becomes a verdict. If you've ever felt like you're walking through conversations instead of participating in them, that's your signal. Not to fix her, not to argue harder, to pay attention, because what you're experiencing isn't bad communication. It's incompatible processing. And incompatible processing doesn't get better with time. It gets louder under stress. Chapter 4. Eventually, it stops feeling mysterious. That's the strange part. Once you've seen the pattern enough times, once you've watched how inputs turn into reactions and reactions turn into chaos, the confusion drains out of it. What's left isn't anger. It's clarity. You realize you're not unlucky. You're not bad at choosing. You weren't missing something subtle. You were ignoring something obvious because acknowledging it would have forced you to act sooner than you were ready to. You see now that this wasn't about social media as an app. It was about orientation, about how someone's mind is pointed. Some people are oriented toward observation, reflection, and synthesis. Others are oriented toward reaction, alignment, and validation. Neither announces itself loudly at first, but over time, orientation reveals itself through behavior, through how someone handles disagreement, through how they process stress, through how quickly they jump to certainty instead of curiosity. And once you see that orientation clearly, you can't pretend you didn't notice it. The reason this matters so much is because long-term relationships don't live in the highlight reel. They live in the margins, in how two people think together when things are unclear, in how they handle moments that don't fit clean narratives, in how willing they are to sit with discomfort without turning it into drama. A person whose inner world is shaped by constant outrage and performative certainty struggles in those margins. They need clarity fast. They need someone to be right and someone to be wrong. They need emotional payoff. And real life doesn't provide that on demand. So they manufacture it. This is why men end up feeling like their lives become noisier, not richer, in these dynamics. Not more meaningful, just louder, more charged, more exhausting. You spend energy managing reactions instead of building something. You spend time clarifying intent instead of making progress. You start associating intimacy with tension, because tension is the primary emotional currency in that worldview. And eventually, you notice that your own nervous system is constantly activated, always on alert, always bracing. That's not love. That's adaptation to instability. The hardest part to accept is that none of this makes her a villain. That's what makes it so easy to rationalize staying. She's not cruel. She's not malicious. She genuinely believes what she believes. She feels what she feels. And that sincerity is what traps men. You don't want to invalidate her experience. You don't want to be the cold, logical guy who doesn't get it. So you keep accommodating, you keep adjusting, you keep explaining. And slowly your life shrinks to fit the emotional perimeter she operates within. At some point, you notice you're not bringing your full self anymore. You're editing, you're filtering, you're choosing silence over honesty, because honesty feels like too much work. And when you do that long enough, you lose access to your own clarity. You forget what it feels like to speak freely. You forget what it feels like to disagree without fallout. You forget what it feels like to exist without emotional management as a constant background task. That forgetting is what costs you the most, not the arguments, not the drama, the erosion of self-trust. Once you recognize that, the decision in front of you changes shape. It's no longer about whether you can tolerate this person. You probably can. Men can tolerate a lot. It becomes about whether you want to build a life inside this framework, whether you want your future shaped by someone whose thinking is externally programmed and internally rigid, whether you want your peace dependent on avoiding triggers you didn't install, whether you want your growth limited by someone else's emotional diet. That's not a moral question. It's a practical one. You might feel a moment of guilt when this realization lands, like you're being unfair, like you're judging too harshly. But judgment and discernment aren't the same thing. Judgment condemns. Discernment observes and chooses accordingly. You're allowed to choose environments that support clarity instead of chaos. You're allowed to want a partner who thinks independently, not predictably. You're allowed to prioritize stability that comes from shared processing, not from one person constantly bending to the other's reactions. There's a reason men who finally leave these dynamics often describe a strange quiet afterward. Not relief in the dramatic sense. Quiet. Their nervous system calms down, their thoughts slow, their energy returns. They realize how much bandwidth had been consumed by managing something that was never meant to be managed in the first place. That quiet isn't loneliness. It's space. And in that space, men often rediscover parts of themselves they didn't realize they'd muted. You start trusting your perception again. You stop second-guessing whether you're crazy for noticing patterns. You realize you weren't overthinking. You were under-responding. You were sensing something early and choosing to override it because you didn't want to seem judgmental or rigid. But rigidity isn't noticing patterns. Rigidity is refusing to adapt once patterns are clear. And adapting sometimes means walking away before chaos becomes your baseline. This doesn't mean you avoid women who post online or have opinions or express emotion. It means you pay attention to how those expressions are formed. Are they thoughtful or reactive? Are they curious or certain? Are they capable of changing with new information or locked into scripts? Those distinctions matter more than aesthetics, politics, or trends. They determine whether a relationship can grow or whether it will endlessly loop through the same conflicts wearing different costumes. If you've stayed through this entire conversation, it's probably because something clicked that you couldn't quite articulate before. Not anger. Recognition. Recognition that you've lived inside this pattern, maybe more than once. Recognition that the chaos wasn't random. Recognition that you ignored early information because it felt impolite to acknowledge it. That recognition isn't meant to harden you. It's meant to sharpen you. You don't need to announce this awareness. You don't need to argue about it. You don't need to convince anyone. You just need to start trusting what you see instead of what you're told to ignore. Pay attention to inputs. Pay attention to reactions. Pay attention to how someone processes the world when things don't go their way. Those details will tell you more about your future with them than chemistry ever will. If this video helped you see something you once dismissed as unimportant, like it. Not because it feels good, but because clarity rarely does at first. And if you want to keep building the ability to read patterns instead of being surprised by outcomes, subscribe. Not for ideology, for discernment. Because the difference between a peaceful life and a chaotic one often comes down to noticing what was visible all along and finally respecting it enough to act.